And joining me now to discuss the need for enhanced disclosure by MPs is the Financial Times Mumbai correspondent whose revelations have drawn attention to this story, James Crabtree, the former editor of The Hindu, Siddharth Varadarajan, the founder of the Association for Democratic Reforms, Professor Jagdeep Chokar, BJP spokesperson Sanjay Kaul, and Congress spokesperson Randeep Singh Surjewala. James Crabtree, last week, in fact on Friday, you did a front-page story for your paper, The Financial Times, revealing how Indian MPs across the political spectrum have relationships with corporate houses which, admittedly, they do not break the law, but they do reveal a potential conflict of interest. You believe that your revelation serves a clear public interest. So let me begin by asking you, for those who don't fully understand the public interest, can you explain what is the public interest here?
Well, I suppose we would say that the public interest in this case is if members of parliament are allowed to have, as parliamentarians, were being in some influenced by the fact that they were being paid by riots to give legal advice.
Professor Chokar, in James's article, you're quoted as saying, and I'm quoting you now, this is a very serious problem. Let me ask you, again, for the sake of the audience, can you explain why do you believe this is a very serious problem?
This is indeed a serious problem because if a member of parliament has a pecuniary relationship with a company which belongs to a particular industry, and this member of parliament takes part in debates, sits on parliamentary consultative committees which have a reference or a relationship with this industry, the people at large are not clear whether the member of parliament is taking a particular stand in the national interest or in the interest of the company in whose pay the member happens to be. Therefore, it undermines the confidence of people in the public affairs of the country.
In fact, it's potentially even worse because the concerned MP could pass off opinion as if it were in the national interest, whereas actually it may simply be motivated by the fact that he's in the pay of a company.
Any time an MP says something in parliament or in a consultative committee, it is assumed that it is in the national interest. And that assumption may well be wrong in these cases.
Siddharth Varadarajan, although in India there is no bar on MPs receiving retainerships from corporate houses, in any major Western democracy, this would constitute a huge scandal. In America, congressmen are completely barred from having such retainerships while they hold a seat in Congress or the House of Representatives. In the UK, such payments have to be declared. Do you believe India needs now to create new rules whereby it follows such Western practices? Okay.
India, as I said, the kind of politician that is emerged today is so different from what he or she was when the Constitution was written and the first elections took place, that we need to bring our rules up to date. And I think what James has written is perhaps just the tip of the iceberg in terms of conflicts of interest of one kind or the other.
Sanjay Kaul, the two MPs who are revealed in James's article happen to be one each from Congress and the BJP. They are Manish Tiwari and Ravi Shankar Prasad. But let me add, there could be many, many more in a number of parties who similarly have been receiving retainerships from corporate houses. Now, I know this is not illegal and it's not barred by the law, but it does lead to potential and very deeply worrying conflicts of interest. So do you accept the point made both by Professor Chokar and Siddharth Varadarajan that we need more stringent disclosure laws, A, for the sake of transparency, and B, to minimize, if not eradicate, conflicts of interest?
Oh yes, I think any reasonable person would have to agree with the larger point being made here, and I will be no exception to that. But I do think that you have to splice the argument a bit to be fair, and if you really want to proceed along the lines of cooperation with regard to everybody involved, you will have to see that this particular case is relevant particularly to lawyers who happen to be on retainers. You do understand that it is not easy for somebody else to be on a retainer of a corporate, and that most people are not really retained by corporates unless they are performing some work or the other. So I think this particular instance was different, number one. Number two, it was also, you will also have to be fair in the sense that work done 5 years ahead of a particular year in which a person may or may not be elected to office is not going to be brought up as the basis for this sort of a thing. So overall, yes, disclosures are absolutely necessary and at every level and every stage, particularly when somebody is taking on office or a ministry or a sensitive post.
Now let me just add that, by the way, when you take up an office, actually by law you have to give up retainerships. Let me just add, Sanjay Kaul, that when you take up an office and become a minister, you have to by law give up retainerships, and both the gentlemen concerned, I will emphasize, did so, or so they have said. This really only applies to people when they're MPs. Now, Randeep Singh Surjewala, in James Crabtree's article, Manish Tiwari, who's one of the named MPs, has accepted that the rules should be changed so that retainers are hereafter declared to Parliament, and he says this is necessary, and I'm quoting him, to keep everything above board. Is that also the Congress party's position, or is it only Manish Tiwari's personal opinion?
Well, Karan, let me just very quickly say a quick conflict of interest. Conflict of interest is what? It is when you're performing public duties and they come into conflict with your private interests in one capacity or the other. Mr. Tiwari was very fair when he said what he said. On a principle which I think your entire panel agrees, there needs to be a codified written conduct for conflict of interest, be it members of parliament or ministers. That conflict of interest or retainership of the types needs to be disclosed well in advance in order to judge your conduct when you are speaking or advocating a particular point on a particular issue. And let me also remind you here that there have been many examples in our parliament. For example, Mrs. Sonia Gandhi chose to resign as a member of parliament when an issue was raised qua her chairmanship of the National Advisory Council, and she decided to get re-elected, go back to people. So there are many, I'm sure there are many other examples. This is the only one that I can remember in the recent past. But I agree, there is need for codification, there is need for laying down certain norms, and there is need for declaration of any interest in a corporate house of any nature whatsoever.
This is very enheartening. Both the Congress and the BJP spokesman concur with the widespread opinion of others that in fact you do need to codify this. You need rules that require regulation and declaration, and they need to be done publicly. Now, James Crabtree, your article says that both politicians say they ceased all commercial legal work upon taking ministerial office. Beyond their saying this to you, can you confirm that's the case? Can you confirm that their retainerships actually ceased when they both became ministers?
Well, in the case of Manish Tiwari, he published a letter that he had sent to Reliance shortly the days after getting his position, and so that seemed fairly definitive. In the case of Mr. Shankar Prasad, I suppose we just believed him. I mean, you know, it seemed like such a. I never really believed that either of them would have continued to take funds while they were ministers, because that's such a serious offence. My sense is that really doesn't happen very often. I might be being naive about that. I think the wider point is an interesting one, which is, you know, the Indian political system is not unique in having these problems. The British political system has a version of it where at least 20 British MPs disclosed the fact that they receive outside incomes of more than £100,000 a year. Now, they do disclose it, but the fact that they have these outside incomes is still considered to be problematic, and a lot of people think it should be banned. So, I mean, the Indian system is probably by no means unique in this regard.
Okay. That's a very interesting point you've heard there from James Crabtree, that disclosure sometimes may not be sufficient because disclosure will still permit the MP to receive the retainership, and the question mark whether his opinion is his own opinion or whether it's being paid for in a sense or motivated will remain. But beyond that, there's a second issue I want to raise. I accept that both Manish Tiwari and Ravi Shankar Prasad stopped their retainerships before they became ministers. But the point that clearly follows is that both served on the 2G JPC while receiving a retainership from Reliance. Would that have constituted a worrying conflict of interest?
It definitely does. And let me take this a little beyond. It has been said that this should be codified and a law should be made and so on and so forth. The Committee on Ethics of the Rajya Sabha says one of the functions of the committee is to oversee the moral and ethical conduct of members. The code of conduct which the Rajya Sabha has laid down for its members is members are expected to maintain high standards of morality, dignity, decency and values in public life. Should members of parliament who make the law for ordinary citizens say we will only not violate the law? Not violating the law is expected of everybody because there are unpleasant consequences for violating the law. Members of parliament ought to observe standards of morality and ethics which set standards for general people.
Which means not just you declare what retainership you get, it actually means you don't take retainerships when you're an MP.
Either you don't take retainership when you're an MP or you don't speak on that subject for which you are taking retainership. Or you disclose. Ethics Committee says that before you say anything in Parliament or in a committee, you should say that I have this interest in this issue.
Siddharth Varadarajan, you've just heard Professor Chokla say that in fact disclosure is not sufficient. You really ought to, in an ideal situation, have no retainerships full stop, as is the case in America. Or at any rate, if you do take retainerships, then you must recuse yourself on any. And in 2012, Outlook listed 5 other MPs who were serving on parliamentary committees with a clear conflict of interest. Doesn't this suggest that we have a much wider problem? It's not an illegal issue because the law doesn't prohibit it, but it's a clear ethical and moral issue, and it runs deep in our parliament.
Absolutely. I think it was absolutely scandalous for Mr. Mallya to be not just in the Civil Aviation Committee, where they later put out that he never attended any meetings, but also on the Chemicals and Fertilizers Committee when he's owner of Mangalore Chemicals and Fertilizers, and he has an interest in that industry. So there are examples of this. One could say that in some sense their offence is a little bit is not as bad as the case of these 2 MPs because everybody knows what Mallya represents, right? But had James Crabtree not filed this story, we wouldn't have known that Manish Tiwari and Ravi Shankar Prasad, as lawyers, were had this relationship with Reliance. And I think it's deeply problematic that both of these gentlemen sat on committees. Ravi Shankar Prasad was part of the standing committee on gas pricing, where Reliance Industries Limited had a direct stake. And I think it is unethical and unconscionable for that not to have been disclosed. And of course, Mr. Prasad continues to insist that there was no wrongdoing because he says, well, fintech is not Reliance and some kind of a screen.
Well, let's not go into the details. Let's not go into the details of these 2 gentlemen because they're not here to defend themselves, and it would be wrong of us to do that when they can't defend themselves. Stick to the general point. Stick to the general point.
Yeah, I'll make a general point, which is the general point is that I don't think, whatever the fine words we've heard from the Congress and BJP spokespersons on your show, that these parties are serious about bringing about a change. We've had many recommendations. I think the Kishore Chand Deo committee in 2008, after cash for questions, had said we need to stop this. There needs to be a bar on people with clear interest being present in standing committees, but there is no appetite on any of the big parties to put an end to this practice because their members are all benefiting from this, and it's part of an ecosystem where politics and big business have gotten enmeshed to the benefit of both of these players, and they don't want to stop this.
You know, Sanjay Kaul, I'll reiterate one thing for the sake of the audience, not really for the sake of the 2 MPs concerned. They are not guilty of breaching the law, but there is certainly huge question marks whether their behavior constitutes ethical practice and moral practice, which is not an illegality, but it is certainly a matter of propriety. Now, it's not just MPs having retainerships, it's not just MPs serving on standing committees where there's a conflict of interest that worries people. There's also the whole question of the nature of asset declaration, A, when they become candidates, and B, when they become elected MPs. First of all, there's no way of verifying the value of the declaration, whether it's correct or wrong. And secondly, practically all MPs put down ancient purchase values rather than the present day actual value. Don't we need to also ensure that simple things like asset declarations are more accurate and the quality is better?
Oh, absolutely. I absolutely agree with you. But I also disagree with the earlier panelist when he said that there is no appetite for change within parties and that the ecosystem continues the way it is. I think the ecosystem is changing. I think this new dispensation is particularly concerned about it in the context of the fact that it is under the cloud of corruption that the entire election of Lok Sabha 2014 was fought. So I would say that there are hopeful signs that there is no need to paint it in a negative light. And take it from us, and if the Congress spokesperson on the show as well as I both commit ourselves to this, it should be seen as a sign of hope, not despair. But coming back to the other point that you said, I agree with you. I also agree with you that often the accuracy and the truthfulness of these declarations are also suspect. That is another aspect that also has to be looked at, because mere declaration, true or false, cannot be the end of the entire asset declaration idea. The whole idea was to bring into public domain accurate information based on which we can make choices about the representatives that we intend to vote for.
Very quickly on that point, Randeep Singh Surjewala, do you accept what he's suggesting, that basically you need a way of verifying that the asset declarations made are accurate? And secondly, if they're not, there should be presumably some form of sanction or punishment. Would you go that far as well?
Mr. Thapar, I think Election Commission needs to seriously look at the issue. There is no denying the fact that asset declaration has to be honest, proper and appropriate. Having said that, there are two very quick issues I want to point out. What about asset declarations and value in case of inherited assets? Assets that someone inherited from his great-grandfather or grandfather or father. What kind of value do you put to that? B, also acquisition value is often shown by various leaders across political spectrum, because that is the value to you unless and until it is sold. So, so it is for Election Commission to set down rates maybe of properties either city or sections wise in order to arrive at a more balanced and harmonious asset declaration.
Let me stop you there,
that
Mr.
could be a way forward. Of course, there could be a larger discussion.
You raise a very important point, and I want to put that to Professor Chokar because I know it's something he's thought about. What Randeep Singh Surjewala is saying is, what happens when someone has inherited land or a house from his grandfather or great-grandfather, which was bought for a fraction of what it's worth today? Do you declare the purchase price or do you declare the present value? Now let me say to you, these asset declarations are not done for tax purposes. They're actually being done to indicate to the Indian viewer or to the Indian voter what the wealth of the MP is. Therefore, surely it must be current value. I know that current value would only be realized when you sell it, but nonetheless that is still the current value. To declare an ancient purchase price as value would be misleading.
You know, I hate to say this. It is very heartening to see both major political parties saying, yes, we have an appetite for change. When we applied to the Rajya Sabha Ethics Committee for a copy of the Register of Interests, that was denied. In the first appeal, it was denied. We had to go to the Central Information Commission to get that data out. And in ADR's experience in the last 15 years, there have been at least 5 to 6 cases where Supreme Court has suggested something be done, where some other authority has suggested something be done, Election Commission has suggested something be done. The entire political establishment, including the two major parties, have gone against it to the Supreme Court. So there is no appetite for change. The explanation for inherited value or current value is a red herring, which has been put up again and again. At least things should be declared and they should be open to scrutiny. That is not being done.
Very quickly, I'm going to end with you, James Crabtree, because in a sense it's your story that has sparked the discussion tonight and focused attention on this phenomenon which otherwise tended to get ignored. What response have you got from Indian politicians after your story appeared? I don't just mean the two that you wrote about, I mean across the spectrum. Or have you had no response from anyone at all?
I mean, I think the politicians that I spoke to in advance of the story when I was researching it and trying to discover precisely what the rules were broadly supportive of the points your panelists have made, which is that there is a problem here and that improved standards of transparency and accountability would benefit the Indian system And these don't have to be very complicated. I mean, at the moment, there is no register of members' interest in the Lok Sabha. And as far as I can see, as your previous panelist just said, the register that does exist in the Rajya Sabha is barely published and very difficult to get hold of. So even fixing those two problems would be a huge step forward, in my view.
And this is clearly a challenge for Mr. Modi, because unlike previous prime ministers, he's very fairly, squarely and repeatedly nailed himself to the mast of transparency and good governance, and these two issues that we're discussing constitute perhaps the very heart of parliamentary transparency and good governance. So we now wait to see whether the enheartening words of Sanjay Kaul and Randeep Singh Surjewala will actually be observed and heeded by their party leaders, and whether we will have action on this. But for now, my thanks to all my guests for joining me.